touch back on what Vlad was talking about, replacing jobs. I think from a founder's perspective, it's very weird for me to hear when people are so scared to say that, oh, AI is going to take someone else's job, right? It's I don't know why, right? It's no one wants to say that openly. But as a founder, the bar is so high, guys. So if anyone wants to be a founder here, the AI bar is so high, right?
Okay, so I'm Kaori Ray, a founder of the podcast. It's called AI Founders Mindset. Yeah, because of mindset is so important. Even though we haven't the monetization yet, but we could change mindset. Okay, I am a founder, or I am a investor like that. So I assume today's our participants, you guys are so visionary founders or potential founders or thinking next startup. So we are so excited to talk with and listening to your stories. So let's get started.
My founder's mindset, you should change it, just don't do that. It's a masochist game. Now we'll start with the first panel. Please can we get the first speakers, Ryan, Tanaka-san, we have Eric, Mohammed, and Vlad. You can please sit in whatever order you'd like to be. So we lost the San Francisco guy because he thinks he's too important. Nobody's recording. Oh, you should cut this. Thank you. No, he couldn't because extreme jet lag, because San Francisco is so far. But we have Mohammed, and he's been working on AI for quite a while, and he's a good friend, sort of. Good, but not sure if he's a friend. So we'll start first with some introduction, just a couple minutes, right, guys? Who are you? Where are you coming from? In general, like, what's your path? What are you doing now? And what's your goal for this year, let's say? And I'll just pass you this mic.
Actually, I learned I was in this panel like 2 hours ago. So I haven't prepared much. But hi everyone, my name is Mohammed. I've been working on AI for like very long before it was cool. Mainly, I have been using AI as like the thread that unifies everything I've been working on. So I applied AI to different contexts. First robotics, then a couple of years in self-driving cars. And currently I'm the head of AI of a blockchain startup, where I'm basically building internal systems like agentic workflows to automate a lot of the, business operations, so to speak, including engineering and stuff like that. On the side, I'm also like independent, AI consultant / advisor, where I work with startups and recently governments on AI strategy and how to apply basically AI to different business problems. So nice to meet you all.
Hi everyone, my name is Vlad. I'm totally different. I come from industry side. My original background was private equity and investment management. And I spent the last 5 years in Japan focusing on the future of work and the human capital side of business, especially since Japan is suffering from labor shortage issue, which is one of the major weaknesses for the economy. And we have an assumption that eventually a lot of other countries will follow the same trend. Japan is just a little bit ahead of the curve. So I launched the company last year called Brands Holdings, where we build a family of generative AI agents aimed to take over some of the most boring and low productivity functions that unfortunately humans have to be engaged in, particularly in the white collar side, professional services, back office, mid office, etc. And we just completing the seed round and created our initial product and started scaling from this month.
Hey everybody, my name is Eric Fong. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Collega AI. I just moved here 1 month ago from San Francisco, so I'm a baby. I'm still in my honeymoon phase, so everything about Japan, I love it. We'll see in a couple months. So prior to this, I have about over a decade of Silicon Valley experience, both as a founder, also as a VC as well too. I was former co-founder of a YC startup. And then now I'm building Collega AI, which is a AI agent that automates SNS marketing for small business owners. And the reason why I'm doing that is because aside from my tech career, I'm also a third generation restaurant owner. So I have it's kind of like a founder market fit, I guess you can say, with small business owners. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm looking forward to meeting everyone here.
thank you for coming. My name is Ryan. I'm actually not co-founder or founder. I'm actually working for, I don't know if you know, like Automation Anywhere. We actually provide the enterprise-grade automation platform for corporate or enterprise-grade corporates. So prior, I was working for like consulting firm and also working for startup companies in UK. So today I'm actually happy to share some of the use cases that Japanese corporate actually trying to implement within like their business processes and also like their business workflow. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So just a little bit of background why this panel, right? I wanted to have somebody more technical, somebody on the business side starting a startup, somebody on the executive enterprise side, right? We have Automation Anywhere, for instance. They compete in certain parts also with Microsoft. So it's a huge company. Go on their website and check it out. They've been going really heavy into AI agents. So we wanted to see what's the perspective of this big enterprise versus smaller SME maybe related startups. So that's more or less we're going to go. We're going to try to get you guys to give us different perspectives from different views. So let's first start with different perspectives on what is an AI agent, right? What's A, so what's artificial, what's the intelligence part, and what's the agent part, right? I know you're very critical about how to define agent. A couple minutes maybe there, not too much. Let's start here.
I plan to provide like two different definitions of like AI agents. The one that you instinctively think of when you hear about agents and know nothing about how AI works, and then the actual one that you can use to build something useful. So the first definition is actually not a new one. It has been there for like, I don't know, a couple decades, and it's what's called rational agents. So a rational agent is an agent that operates on inputs and within an environment, so it receives some sensory input or inputs that you provide to it, and it works within an environment, and then it produces outputs, to be more precise, actions, with the goal of maximizing some performance metric. So that's like mouthful. It's probably there's a very easy example to explain what a rational agent is. So a company is a rational agent. So the environment of a company is the market and whatever regulation it has to observe before it takes any actions. Inputs are what your competitors are doing, market needs, and also resources. And then the action you can take is, well, you can launch a product, you can launch a marketing campaign and stuff like that. And then the metric you're trying to optimize or maximize is your profit. So as you can see, the rational agent definition can be applied broadly to a lot of things. And since the goal of AI is to replace more or less what we can do as humans with machines, then it makes sense to have this definition as the core goal of like the field as a whole, or I'd say the unifying abstraction that you can use to basically talk about what you're working on. And so in my perspective, AGI is not something that you can achieve by, let's say, building bigger LLMs or better LLMs. Actually, it's only achieved by building autonomous rational agents. So the moment we can have something that we can call an autonomous rational agent, then we have achieved AGI. So that's the kind of theoretical, the ideal definition. A more practical definition that you can use actually to build stuff is, well, an agent is something that receives inputs. It's designed in a way to select specific actions that are useful in some sense. So notice here, I don't have anything about like optimizing some metric or any of these things. You can design something, an agent specifically do one thing and do it very well, and you still call it an agent. And then an AI agent is something that has within its components some algorithm that is, well understood as an AI algorithm. It doesn't have to be an LLM. It can be an optimization algorithm, can be planning algorithm, and so on. And so there are two consequences to this definition. Number one, LLMs are not agents. Number two, you don't need LLMs to build agents. So these solve specific problems in certain ways, but you don't need to have LLM to call yourself building agents. So these are the two definitions that I want to share today.
Next, we'll go to who really disliked this definition. I think Ryan, you don't know. From the enterprise perspective, like what is an AI agent? Right, from automation anywhere, how do you see it?
Right. So from our company's definition, AI agent is your conscience. So if you provide input, the agent actually autonomously execute the actions without human interruptions. That's we call it for definition of the AI agent. And AI agent actually, the core technology from our side is like the RPA. RPA actually used to do automate your repetitive task, right? But with the AI, they're actually able to understand the context and also automate or execute actions by understanding the context that you actually provide. That's the AI agent from our definition.
Too far.
You guys want to add something as well?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I agree with everything Mohammed has to say. So it's whatever I say is plus his. No, I like to dumb it down a little bit because I think a lot of people confuse chatbots with AI agents. I target a very non-technical audience, so I explain it in a very simple fashion. Not super technical, but in a way that's really easy to understand. And that's basically, if you think of a chatbot, I would consider this more as a virtual consultant, right? Where you're sending and asking information, you're getting data back, they have a pretty good understanding of what your business is about, but then they also have a knowledge base of what they can offer you, right? But I would compare it to an AI agent as a virtual full-time employee, where it goes beyond just question and answer and just retrieving data from specific databases or knowledge base. It's more actionable, right? So you're telling me that, hey, this is what you should be doing to improve your business. So since I believe in this, I'm going to go ahead and do it for you as well too, right? So I would say AI agent is much more actionable as opposed to a chatbot is more, ask and receive, ask and receive.
Yeah, I think I agree pretty much with everyone here. It's pretty straightforward. So we get a variety of technical definitions here. I think the only probably element I would add on the business side is similarly to what Brian said. I think we kind of, from business perspective, it's not a part of definition, but we kind of expect agents to be specialized to some extent, right? Because what we have, for example, with the chatbots like ChatGPT is kind of like a general conversationalist type of a person who may or may not be knowledgeable in some areas. But from the practical standpoint, when we talk about AI agent startups or AI agent technology in enterprise tech, we probably expect them to be a little bit more focused. For example, following on the idea that AI agent replaces a real employee to some extent. Well, real employees do have speciality, right? So they have back office, they have mid office, they have lawyers, accountants, like coders, etc. So I think in an ideal world, and we're still kind of at the beginning stage of it, we probably would want to have these agents focused and getting access to or having some knowledge database in particular areas so they can actually be efficient replacing humans in some of these spaces where we want them to be active. So this is probably the one element I'd like to add.
Great. I think more or less similar. You guys are boring. Should fight a little bit. Great. No, love it. Next, I wanted to stay with you, right, Vlad. You've been mainly on the private equity side and so on. You guys are great in buying out companies and firing a bunch of people, right?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Right. And then first, when you introduced yourself, you said to automate the boring parts of the jobs. And now I'd like to go towards, not too philosophical, but do you want to augment humans, replace humans, right? Where is the direction in terms of human capital? Because it's also part of your background, right? What do you think is going to happen? Are we going to all lose our jobs to these AI agents?
Right, so I have a lot to say here, and I have a very strong opinion, and I hope someone disagrees with me. It would be nice to argue. So I think that augmenting humans fundamentally involves replacing humans. So to augment humans, we have to replace them first. So I see a historical parallel. If we look at 19th century, like 150, 160 years ago, a lot of people, if we were all born there, a lot of people would be involved in very hardcore manual labor, like work in the factories, like doing things with our hands. It's waking up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, going to fields, like working with rice. So it was like horrible labor environment. And then with the great industrial revolution, we started using machinery. And when these new machines appeared, a lot of workers were very much against them because they said, well, now machines can do everything, like what I'm going to do, I'm going to starve, I can't really feed my family anymore. So the general sentiment was very, very negative. And rightfully so. Machines did replace most of these jobs. But look what happened. So 150 years later, we all do things which we wouldn't be able to explain to our grandparents, right? If you go back in time and meet your ancestor in like 1850 and try to explain what the hell you do for a living, they wouldn't be able to comprehend it, right? Because it's just like all these concepts are completely alien, right? So we'll probably have something similar because this is exactly what happened during the human history. So every new cycle, something like that happened and we just went to the next level, and now we can sit in this warm, comfortable office and have conversation about AI instead of harvesting rice, right? So we do need to kill a lot of these jobs, and it's not really a bad thing. So over the past 5 years, and I started first noticing it in private equity, when you try to understand, you have this leadership thing, and when you buy the company, you start by replacing their key management. So you try to find a good CEO or like good CFO, and usually it's done in a very random way. So usually your senior partner would know some dude they used to work together like McKinsey or Goldman, and they're like, yeah, he's going to be good, let me call him. And I noticed that the impact of this one specific element is significant. So investors, they, as most of VCs here would know, you take everything into account. So you try to look at the cash flow, the growth potential, the asset prices, the cost of debt, like pretty much everything. And then there's this significant thing, like who you're going to hire to run this ship, to drive this car, has a massive impact. You can have a fantastic company, and like a wrong choice of a leader, it may not be a bad guy, he was just not the right guy for this company, can completely ruin it. Happened many times. Look at, Nike. Was it Nike recently? They had this dude who was a very senior partner in Bain, and he used to work with Nike forever, and he joined the company, and it was very pure data-driven strategy to enhance their sales, didn't go anywhere. Like absolute disaster. And sometimes you have a pretty normal average company, and there's some like charismatic guy who's really passionate about it, and they turn it around and it becomes a miracle. So the impact is absolutely significant. But in reality, most people are not doing the jobs they want to do. Most of us have to compromise, and instead of pursuing our dreams, we just choose whatever is there, and we hate our job, but we need to make money because we have families and mortgages and commitments. And a lot of people don't even get close to realizing their true potential. They're just trapped in a kind of non-customized, like very stagnant, very rigid corporate environments where their performance is obviously below average. So the reason, like over maybe the past 5 years, I talked to more than 10,000 people, I believe, and here in Japan, and most of them don't really like their jobs. And at least they like less than 50% of their jobs. And from the company's perspective, the problem is different. They look at this human capital and they think, well, we really have top performers. Most people we have, they're kind of like average or below average. They're not really rock stars. And everyone wants to hire a rock star. But what makes this difference, right? Like why this kind of thing happens? Fundamentally, it's because a lot of people love some elements of their jobs, usually about like 10, 20%, but really hate the rest. So probably most people here would agree with this sentiment, that this is unfortunately what we have to do. So AI can give us flexibility to reconsider how we deploy our capabilities and how we build this actual future of work. So all these areas which we don't really find fascinating, and it's usually boring, routine, standardized job functions. This is precisely what AI can do really, really well. But everything else which we actually enjoy doing, we can decide to focus on. So probably next 10 years time, like maybe 20 years time, we'll have completely different types of jobs, hopefully with much higher productivity, but more importantly with higher level of engagement, where people can actually enjoy a lot more of what they do and just having fundamentally more meaningful lives. So I think this is the key point where we are. But to do that, we do need to kill a lot of these jobs because they are not supposed to be done by humans fundamentally. We just didn't have any better way until now. So yes, I would love to kill a lot of these jobs, and I would love to start it as a kind of, a beginning of a new cycle when we create better jobs and build a more equitable, more enjoyable future of work.
Thanks. Who here hates their job? Nobody?
I don't believe you guys.
Something of your job. A colleague of yours. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to mention that company because it's recorded, but we know who it is.
That's why nobody really answers.
That's actually an awesome company, I think. I don't trust him. Let's go from here to Ryan. right? From the perspective of automation anywhere, or your perspective working with enterprise, right? Here we're thinking about automating some parts of the work, but what are you seeing right now? Some examples that you've seen most of the impact, where enterprise is actually asking some of these automations, and where do you think they're still not looking hard enough? And that's really about the use cases.
Right. So most of the Japanese corporate that I've seen are actually trying to explore use cases, especially in the customer service or customer support, where there's some like operators to try to get some answers from the database and get some answers and reply to the message to the the initial inquiry. That's the most of the cases that I've seen from my perspective. But also at the same time, Japanese corporate are actually trying to explore more use cases beside the customer support or customer centers to get more ROI, because only that few use cases can't really guarantee the ROI. Especially like our enterprise software is like really expensive, because our average product, the price is about like more than like 100K. So in order for them to actually get a return on investment, they actually exploring like some of the use cases besides those customer support and also the call centers at the moment. That's my perspective.
Where do you think they're going to go with the improved capabilities of these agents, LLMs, non-LLMs? You know, Lucy, previously it was just RPA, right? It's predefined rules, if else, right? But now you have some sort of semantic capability of these more dynamic pieces of code. But we're going to be better and better where we'll be able to do multi-step more precisely. Where do you think this year can go in terms of your applications?
Yeah, sure. I can't really disclose the name of the company, but yesterday I talked one of the largest manufacturing company, and what they actually saying, they wanted to actually optimize employees' the workflow and also their work hours, because like a blast shortage, they do that overwork. In order for them to actually make sure that they actually optimize their business hours and also their workforce. They actually keep track of the activities of the employees, and then provide some the feedback based on the long hours and also the activities of the employees, to rather than your boss or your the seniors giving the feedback. AI actually provide the feedback based on the employees' activities. That's one of the use cases that I actually talked to yesterday with one of the largest manufacturing companies.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that. We're gonna go back to our unprepared guest here near me. Mohammed, you're the most technical here on the panel. You've heard about all of these potential applications and so on. What are the difficulties now, technically, in implementing this? What needs to be solved, and what's possible? What people are talking about. There are lots of agent examples, but lots of it is fluff. It's hype. But eventually, we're going to get certain directions. So, what are the technical difficulties? How are they getting tackled? And what are the improvements you're seeing in this particular year?
So I think the biggest difficulty actually is the lack of the right abstractions. So building agents at that scale is something new. So people don't have the primitives that they can use to build stuff with it. And so what we are having right now is a zoo of frameworks where everyone defines their primitives in a different way. And then in order to build with something, you need to learn that thing. And so obviously if you work with framework A, you're not going to be able to work with framework B without relearning and all these stuff. So that's natural stage, I'd say. So we're trying to explore how best we decompose what we need in order to have more standardized way to build stuff. So this is the first difficulty, I'd say. Another one is that I think most people are, let's try to put it in a polite way.
Please don't.
Not very sure about when and how to use agents, and so some people treat it as silver bullets that can fix everything. Some people refuse it completely. So the right kind of sentiment is actually to have a balanced approach. So you understand that basically there are two main ways that you can conceptualize how and when to use agents, right? So the first one, and this kind of like from my own experience, the first one is you can use agents as a way to, turn unstructured data into some structured format, or what I call conversation agents. So in a way, I understand that chatbots are not considered AI agents, but from my perspective, they are one type of AI agents actually. So it doesn't have to take action. It needs to do something useful in a sense that a human would, do it if they were there, right? So most companies have tons of unstructured data that's basically inaccessible. And if I can add a layer that I can use it to talk with this data, that's very useful. So this is one way of using agents. The second one, and actually the most important one, is workflows based. So like agentic workflows. How you can basically use agents to replace, well, not only jobs, but we can have certain workflows within a job. So like a human job is one or more workflows that they keep doing repeatedly. And one way to kind of use agents to enhance how we work is to define certain workflows end to end, and then we try to automate these using agents. And again, so since we don't have primitives, and it's very difficult for most people to define actually what their workflows are, we need to kind of fix these.
Cool. We'll pass to Eric now. You've mentioned the proliferation of dev tools and frameworks and so on, and Mohammed mentioned. You're 3 years in the startup in dev tools, right? You were in YC 2019, right? And you've built it for 3 years. Now, there've been a lot done on the dev tooling side for agents, workflows, and so on, from LangChain and to lots of others. Reworked, Multion, which was supposed to be the first speaker. Why have you decided to now focus not on dev tools again, where you built a lot of expertise, but actually go into a niche? Because I've seen some of these players actually switched and then went into a niche because dev tools, nobody wants to use dev tools. All these smart engineers, they just want to build their own, right? Try to sell that. So what was your thinking?
First of all, dev tools are really freaking hard to sell. Developers are the most unforgiving group of people on earth, right? They have so many options. New options are coming out every single day. You lose one person, you lose an entire community, right? It's very unforgiving. So I think for me, I do believe the future of AI is going vertical now. We see a lot of general tools that are able to answer a lot of things good, but nothing really great. So how are we actually going to apply AI towards meaningful business problems, right? I think that's the biggest thing here, right? And what does meaningful problem really mean? It means, are they going to open up their wallets for your solution, right? And there's a lot of problems now across verticals, whether it's F&B, which I'm in, hospitality, construction, etc. There's a lot of problems there that are still living in 20, 30, 40 years ago. A lot of process needs to be automated. And I do want to touch back on what Vlad was talking about, replacing jobs. I think from a founder's perspective, it's very weird for me to hear when people are so scared to say that, oh, AI is going to take someone else's job, right? It's I don't know why, right? It's just no one wants to say that openly. But as a founder, the bar is so high, guys. So if anyone wants to be a founder here, the AI bar is so high, right? And especially if you're selling AI solutions to B2B, right, businesses, you have to be able to, your North Star should be replacing a human being. Otherwise, your customer is simply not going to buy from you, right? So what's the main value when someone buys a solution, right? It saves them money, right? And the biggest cost is labor. So if you're just offering solutions that just automate a couple workflows here and there, and the owner is like, hey, this actually doesn't really affect my bottom line, the PO is not coming in, guys. Right? You're not selling anything. You're just another project in a sea of salmon, right? All these other projects. So I think for founders, we have a very high bar to meet, and we have to chase after replacing human beings, whether or not we'd like to admit it or not.
And staying still with you, given that you're now working on this product for sales, right? And I suppose you'll have a bunch of autonomous agents for that, right? How do you ensure that that your customers trust these agents who have autonomy? Like they allow them, so they actually use your tool.
Yeah, I think my TA is a little bit different than most people. I'd like to say that we hear about AI everywhere we go, but guys, we're still in a bubble here, right? Like if you go to your favorite restaurant owner and ask them what's your favorite LLM, they're like, what are you talking about? Have you heard of ChatGPT or OpenAI? They have no clue, right? So I think, at least for our TA, some sort of human intervention, some sort of human connection is really, really important for us. And what we're doing is that we're automating SNS marketing for small business owners. So we're talking about their brand image here, right? We're talking about how they're being represented on social media. And we know that in Japan specifically, image is very important, especially for small businesses. So I'm lucky enough where we're generating content and automating SNS workflows, but we still involve the customer, right? Like you still have to approve what we're doing, right? You still have to review what we're doing. So the customer still has a little bit of editing power. They still have a little bit of say. That's the only way that you can really work with this TA and build trust with them. And I can't speak on behalf of other AI solutions where they sell more to technical folks, where some people just completely trust AI. But I don't think that we're at that point in progress now that we can completely trust AI without any specific guardrails, whether technical or human related.
Great. Now, before going to the Q&A, I have lots of questions here. Thank you, ChatGPT. I prepared them. Just improve the language. I'm not a native speaker. Vlad, for you, you're not on the technical side, right? When was this aha moment for you, when you saw something happening and thought, this is the future of work, right? Because that's what you're talking about. I've seen that in your deck multiple times. It's like, what was it when you realized that you should work on this specifically?
Well, I was always very interested in how we can create a better capability deployment environment since my private equity experience, so probably for the past maybe 5-6 years. And it's just we didn't really have a technology to offer a scalable solution. So there are different ways, you can use software already, and you could have used software 5 years ago to automate different parts of what we call workflow, or I would call it job functions. So for example, in HR field, which is very dear to my heart, in Japan we even have some unicorns. We have companies like Smart HR, we have companies like HR Brain, we have companies like Kaunavi or Talent Palette, and they all automate different parts of workflows, right? So they can automate payroll, they can automate to some extent talent management, they can automate some different elements of reskilling or even talent acquisition or etc. So there were always solutions, right? I mean, we've been having software for past 40 years. The question is how do you scale it? How do you offer a really scalable solution that can have a proper large impact? And we didn't really have it until the debut of ChatGPT. And I totally agree with Eric here that the going niche, what we call by going niche and what I mentioned before by having speciality, is basically offering a more kind of targeted approach, which at the same time is more scalable. So, and this moment just came maybe 2 years ago when we started getting this first AI chatbots, and the question was all right, so we have this nice conversationalist, what else can it do? And I agree with Mohammed, it's already an agent, because you can give it a simple task and it can do it, right? Similarly to a human. But the question is, can we give it a more complex type of tasks? What sort of data this agent should have access to be able to perform? And it's very similar to a human being, because for example, if you're a child, you can already do some very simple things, right? The more you learn, you go to school, you go to university, you get a major, you get a deeper knowledge in a particular area, and you start building up your capabilities, and then you get real life work experience, and you can start deploying these capabilities, and this is where you can actually contribute to the society. So we're having now that with AI, It's still very early stage. There are a lot of limitations, but niche areas are probably easier to start the implementation process because there's a more clearly defined knowledge base. For example, we've been talking before with one of the guests here on some like legal technology, right? So agent can get access to a certain legal knowledge base and to some extent automate the work of junior lawyers. If you work, for example, in financial transactions, agent can get access to the like numerical data for any particular M&A and severely like help saving time for junior associates by building Excel LBO models, or assist management consultants by structuring data related to a particular, a company or a particular market and creating a nice PowerPoint. So instead of having like 5 junior consultants working till 5 a.m. in the morning on their 25th cup of coffee, making some mistakes in this PowerPoint, you can have AI doing that. So it all starts from very niche application, and then this data starts accumulating, and AI can become more precise. And this is also what helps us to get a better trust, I guess, with the clients, because they can see, right, so the knowledge base that my agent has access to is very similar to what my actual employees have access to, right? And it can be faster, it doesn't make mistakes, it's available 24/7, and it offers like a standardized solution. Well, for example, if we have employee, every person will do their thing in their own way. So this is the level where it starts creating value, and once that became visible, it was pretty clear that this is really the direction we should be going to for everyone's benefit, not just corporate, but the employees themselves.
Nice. And this is quite a different answer that I would have expected from an engineer. That would be, oh, evals here, precision. Business people don't care. Just deliver value, right? Before we move on to the questions, to the Q&A, is there anything, guys, that I've missed and you think should be said right now? Not necessarily all of you, like somebody who wants to pick the mic.
Thank you guys for a very interesting talk. It's been very interesting to learn about AI agents and stuff. I do have a question about when all jobs are taken, right? And these AI agents are running entire businesses. What happens when, for example, the AI shuts down or something happens? Who is there, or what guardrail is going to be in place to help the business get back on track? And where do you see the future of those type of positions coming in later on?
The fixer agent.
I think it's actually very simple to answer. It's the same guardrails and systems we have in place to keep all software working right now. So an agent is basically a software system. So you want to make sure it's working 100. Well, you cannot reach 100%, but you can keep 99.999%. So I think we'll just use our engineering knowledge to make sure that these, keep working.
Yeah, I think it's even further. It's same as like internet or even electricity. Like, what would happen if electricity is suddenly off, right? But I think there's general assumption that AI will take like all the jobs. I don't think it will happen. AI will take probably most of the jobs that we have today, like similarly to the way like machines took a lot of jobs that people had in the 19th century. But we'll have some different jobs. Like, we have 8 billion people in the world. Even if this number decreases, people will always be doing something in some way, deploying their skills and knowledge and finding a way to generate resources to continue living. So humanity is not just going to suddenly disappear and then do nothing. So there will be some different things to do. Maybe we'll have kind of, more equitable society. I don't know, maybe will lead us to universal basic income. Like, I don't know, there are a lot of different models that can happen. But yeah, something will definitely be there.
More TikTokers.
Actually, that's true.
Unfortunately.
It's been banned. First there was a question here.
Thank you. Hi. So my question to you is, when you go to a company and you want to automate all of those AI processes, how would you tackle it? So if you go to a traditional, let's say, pharmaceutical company or a factory, like, what is your approach to analyze the processes so you can just implement agents and AI flows?
I think from more of a founder's perspective, people like to think that, hey, let me approach a business and ask them what they have not automated yet and try to solve that problem. But we're asking them, what have you automated and how much are you paying for it, right? And are you paying for it, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the automation that they're opening up their wallets for that really matters the most. That's the priority, right? Think about us every single day, right? I mean, we do things that we really, really hate, but we don't hate it enough for us to go out of our way to pay someone to do it or buy a solution to do it, right? And that's where ChatGPT came in. That's really good, right? People can't live without it, right? Because it's able to automate tasks that we think is worth automating. So I think if you're building a company and you're trying to figure out what you should automate, talk to the customer, get their feedback, and also ask them like, what are you paying for, how much, and why are you paying for it? And then try to figure out if your solution can be better.
Yeah, one first.
From my perspective, to answer the questions, we have two approaches. One is we do provide the workshop to understand their business processes. And second is we already have a tool to keep track of the activities of the employees. So for example, if you say, let's say like if you use a computer every day, right? You have user applications. So we have a tool to keep track of the how much time you spend on the application, or how much time, or like what kind of tool you're using day-to-day work, so that we can actually create the business workflow chart to understand what kind of business processes what you're actually doing, so that we can actually understand visually this is like what you should automate because you spend like X amount of time on this business process. So there are two approaches from our perspective.
This has been a great talk, everybody. Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers. So I'm Evan, co-founder of Kimata AI. There's been a lot of talk recently about how agentic AI will replace SaaS. And if we think about the CEO of Microsoft's talk that kind of went viral on that subject, and what he was referring to, it was the layer between the human and the underlying essentially database, right? And SaaS has been that layer. But that's not my question. My question is, SaaS is essentially a business model and a pricing model. How do we price agentic AI? What are your thoughts on that? And this is obviously from a startup founder's perspective.
Yeah, I can answer that. I would say you price it based on how much it will cost for human labor. Right? For us, we're automating SNS marketing for restaurant owners and other types of F&B businesses. How much do you typically pay for a human to do this job? Whether it's hiring a part-time employee to do it or a marketing agency to do it, that is the price point you should be not trying to replicate, but going towards, right? Because how much they're willing to pay for it. And I think that's how you should price it. For us, AI can do things at a fraction of the price of human labor, so we can charge significantly lower than a human SNS manager. But at the same time, as a founder, we gotta make sure that we're paying the bills, right? And then the VCs are happy, right? That's how I look at pricing, at least.
I can add a little bit here. I think it's a very interesting question because it's still a very new thing, and probably each startup has their own strategy and their own thoughts when it comes to pricing, and it's very difficult to create some kind of standard. But I think in the long run, it will not be different from SaaS itself, because fundamentally, in the way that AI, like Eric just said, replaces human labor, SaaS did the same thing. We just figured out that we can create this licensing model, and we can charge a certain amount per month per license. And then this is the kind of margin we should be targeting, like, I don't know, 70% or whatever. And with AI, we can have much higher margin, by the way. It can be like 200, 250%, because the intrinsic costs are very low, and they will probably start getting lower. But then as a company, you need to take into account like other costs, such as marketing and, like a normal business. But fundamentally, it's true, like we have to benchmark the labor, human labor. We have to offer some significant cost savings, so it shouldn't be like exactly the same amount, otherwise it doesn't make sense. But fundamentally, in terms of the type of the pricing strategy you got to choose, it probably will be something similar to SaaS, because a lot of enterprises already get used to it. So it will be some kind of licensing, it will be depend on the number of accounts you have, will depend probably on the number of like tokens you use per calculation, per transaction, in a way like ChatGPT calculates it. But fundamentally, the margin there is very significant, and it's always going to be lower than using human labor for that. So whichever model we will eventually come up with will offer significant cost savings for the clients and significant margins for the AI companies.
Someone actually asked me about this, the exact same question about agents replacing SAS and so on. And honestly, I think it doesn't make sense to actually even say that statement, because it's just like you're fundamentally changing the operator of something. So SAS is a cloud-hosted human operating system, operated system. Agents are going to be the operator of the same cloud, hosted system. And so pricing strategies more or less will be the same if you're working with the cloud side. But agents provide a different model that's interestingly the original software pricing model is local agents, because you can use them as a software that you install. We used way before SaaS to buy software and then you install it once and you own it end to end. This will come back basically. So people who care about privacy and working with sensitive data will opt for buying local agents, and people who are okay with more I don't want to say less privacy, but we're okay with using cloud systems are still going to be using a system similar to SaaS.
By local, you mean on-premise, right?
On-premise, yeah, that's right.
So what do we do when VC stops underwriting the entire industry? Because we're building on OpenAI and Claude and stuff like that right now, right? When that money runs out and they're forced to be profitable, our costs are going to skyrocket, right?
So thankfully, there is the open source AI movement happening right now. So I think what should be done is not only focus on the big closed providers, because I don't think it's actually sustainable long term, as you just said. And the way I see it is that people will be going more and more to on-premise and local model. We're not even talking businesses here. I, as a person, I want to have a system that goes through all my emails and do something with it. I definitely don't want to share this with OpenAI. So I need an easy way to run models and on my laptop to do that. And so I think what should be done is to pay attention to what's happening in the open source side and try to think how to turn this into a business opportunity, but at the same time not to get rid of the closed source models yet, because we don't have enough hardware or software infrastructure to replace that model yet.
Two more quick questions, one here and
Right, so this one's straightforward. So I have a problem statement, an area of work that I want to deploy agents for. I do know that I'll have to have, or I have to make a choice around the number of agents that I create to solve that larger problem. It will be one or more. I'm struggling really deeply to find references or people thinking about the frameworks, how to distribute the boundaries between, do I need one, do I need 6, do I need 10 that are networked together, or do I need one that is a bit more powerful? Are you guys aware of anyone thinking deeply about that problem or papers around that problem?
Maybe I can start. I think it's not even an AI problem, it's HR problem. The same problem, removing AI from the equation, just you're running the business and you have some employee, you're gonna have the same problem. So for example, there are things that have to be done. How many people do you need to do them? Do you need one superstar, I don't know, Harvard MBA grad who's super quick and multilingual, or he's too expensive and he's too ambitious and you better hire 5 people who are slightly lower tier, and then you need to create some kind of job description for the roles they're going to take over, right? And then you need to create some kind of compensation system and then create some kind of HR strategy and some kind of a logic, who reports to whom and how do you benchmark it against your competitors. And there's a lot of things to do. So it's HR issue fundamentally.
So in essence, you're saying number of agents equals the number of JDs that usually you have to solve that problem fully.
Not necessarily, because I think a lot of JDs and a lot of jobs that we actually have in a standard corporate environment are fundamentally not efficient anyway. So they're just designed in a very bad way, or they haven't got updated since 1980s. And this is the reason why people actually hate their jobs, because a lot of things that they are supposed to do, they just don't make any sense. So you spend a lot of time on corporate bullshit instead of actually focusing on what really creates impact. But what I'm trying to say is that fundamentally it's not an AI issue, it's HR issue. So you have to fundamentally understand how you run your business, what are the really critical parts, what are the parts that are not needed, and you will have to answer the same exact questions with just normal human beings. And if you, and nobody can really advise you how to do it because it's your business to operate. So you have to really look into it and understand what's happening there. Maybe you can hire some management consulting firm who will create some HR strategy for you. But once you have that, it's a lot easier to understand how you can save costs here with AI, because you can understand the capacity of AI. I understand, okay, so this is, I don't know, my 5 people spend like 30 hours like every week doing that. I can have one AI agent which does that in like 10 seconds, for example. Great, so I can replace this function and my people can be better distributed doing something else. So this is it.
I think you're asking more at the implementation level rather than, okay, so actually this is something I'm personally working on. So there's no frameworks released yet. It's more like the conceptual approach, how to do it. Basically, what I noticed is that it's more of an engineering problem. Right now, it's more art than science. Like you actually need to start building a system, and then we'll go back to my conversation about the lack of primitives. Basically, your question is that what are the right primitives that we can use to decide how many agents to do a specific task? We don't have this right now, and so like everyone who's working on this problem tried to come up with their own primitives. And if like you want a very high level kind of guiding principle, at least this is what I'm using. LMs are not, if you're talking also like LM-based systems, right? LMs are not good at doing a lot of things at the same time. And so you need to decompose whatever you're trying to do into something that will define tasks that a single agent can do. By an agent, I mean just a simple component that calls, let's say, OpenAI and does something specific. And so the problem turns from, I have an LLM and I want to do this task, to how can I build an architecture that actually satisfies what I'm trying to do. And so agents, this is something probably I will give a different talk on. So agents are not, like 90% LLMs and some stuff around them. It's more of a full architecture and workflow. And the first step to build agentic systems is to decompose whatever you're trying to do into these primitive components, and then, it's more like trial and error as well. So I can't think of a specific, definition. It's not working. Let me, decrease the scope of this task for this agent and so on. Hopefully this answers your question.
Okay, we have 1 minute to be just 10 minutes late. Last one question, one answer.
Okay, I'll keep it short. JP from Legal and Technologies. Thanks for the talk. So we know Japan's a bit behind in terms of adoption of AI generally. I think the theme, unfortunately, will continue with agents. You were mentioning a few cases that Automation Anywhere is implementing. So given that Japan may be a bit behind, globally at the group level, what are some of the edge cases that internally you're excited about, that just to see what's starting to be implemented?
That's a difficult question. But I can share one of the use cases. There's a company where they want to keep track of the ticket from the customers or inquiries, right? But also at the same time, they keep track of the what kind of inquiries they're getting, and what kind of percentage they can actually satisfy the customers automatically without any human intervention. That's the one of the use cases that a global company actually trying to create for AI agent use case. That's the one of the use cases. I don't know if that answered the question, but is it clear or?
Yep.
Great. You can do it later. We'll have an hour more or less. Cool, guys. Loved it. Thanks a lot. And Mohammed, thanks for. Great question. We should have probably just started with Q&A. You guys are much better than me. Let's go to the next one. Get out of here, guys. We'll get now the next. I'll just pass to you. Thank you.